Brothers and sisters, let me tell you, this is how valuable you are. I think the universe would hide you in its pockets so that you would never be scratched and never receive a ding or a dent.
I'm preaching you just like I would have in the old days, just minus a few characters in the story.
There's no mention of God or Jesus.
Can I get a Darwin?
Prepare yourself for a journey of discovery. The book has been written, the speeches have been done, and now it is time to go between the pages with Jerry DeWitt and Bobby C. Today's date is August 18th, 2016. My name is Bobby C., and once again I am joined by my amazing co-host, the one and the only Mr. Jerry D.
Evening, Bobby C.
How you doing, Jerry?
I'm doing really good. How are you doing?
I'm frustrated, buddy.
Oh, tell me all about it.
Frustrated. Oh, we have been
all about it.
We have been battling audio for the last half hour?
Oh yeah. The entire time that we were going to do a pre-show, we were battling real issues.
Yeah, we were. Matter of fact, they don't even get a pre-show. Yeah, no pre-show for you guys this week. I'm sorry about that. We battled audio all the way up to a minute before going live.
Yes, and what was really fun was I muted my microphone so that you could do your producer stuff, and I could still hear you cussing your computer in the background, and I couldn't reply or give any sympathetic words.
Yeah, I did that just for you, just for your entertainment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Well, folks, I'm going to let you guys know we are on a very, very tight schedule tonight.
Yep, gotta go. That's it. See y'all later.
We truly do have a very tight schedule. This show needs to be completed within the hour. Unfortunately, Jerry is traveling, and the Wi-Fi that he is allowed to use to do this show is only for a limited time. So we are not going to take too much time bantering back and forth. If you want to get your questions and comments on the air, you can live tweet during the show at Hope After Faith, or you can join us in the chat room on Spreaker.com. This week's episode is part 2 of a 3-part series titled What Most Christians Don't Know About the New Testament. And from what I understand, Jerry, in this episode, we're going to discuss the 2 separate types of Christianity within the New Testament.
Yes, and the reason that this is important to me is because at least my perception of the evangelical theology of today is that Christians are trying to be as apostolic. They're trying to be as much like the characters in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts that we read. They're trying to get their doctrine to be as much like the New Testament doctrine as possible. And that's kind of the whole core of the motivation. That's why Methodists are better than Episcopalians, and Pentecostals are better than Baptists, because each one of those denominations believe that they're closer to that one true original doctrine of the New Testament. And what we're going to see is that there were divisions and different gospels even within the New Testament itself.
Right. Well, you gave me a link for me to read and study, because, folks, I'll be honest with you, I didn't have a clue about what Jerry's going to talk about tonight. He sent me a link for me to kind of study. And, I've read the Bible multiple times, but never did I put 2 and 2 together like you're going to do tonight, to the point that there's even 2 different salvation stories, or 2 different types of salvation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not surprising that this isn't something that you're familiar with. I think it's something that a lot of Christians are not familiar with. I'm sure that they've caught little pieces of it in passing. And the way that theology works, the way that apologetics works, you can always emphasize whatever part you want to emphasize in order to make your point and to substantiate your position. But not being a debater, not being an apologist or a theologian, I like to just step back and just have a real world view, to actually put myself in the lives, in the stories that I'm reading, and try to imagine how that would affect my daily life, affect what I think is true and my ultimate belief system, and then bring that back with me into the present time and say, okay, is what I'm being taught in Christianity, does it match the experience that I have out of the New Testament? And I think it's going to be obvious that it does not.
Indeed. So if you're ready, sir, let's get this thing started, because I don't even know where to begin with this. But that's why I have you.
It is a hard one to figure out where to start. Yeah. So let's go to the book of Galatians.
Okay.
And I think that this is a great place to start, because Paul is making a case. And the case that he's trying to make is that there, in his mind, is only one gospel. There's only one real way of doing this. And we'll see that over time, if you study the New Testament, what you find out is that there were opposing views. Obviously, he thinks his view is righter than other people's views, but the other people are very prominent people. We could just as easily have a Bible and a New Testament in particular that would be made up of other people's writings, other prominent characters in the New Testament story, other than Paul. But it just so happens the majority of the New Testament is a reflection of Paul's theology. Mm-hmm. And so we get his side of the story, that he's wrestling with all these competing ideas, and he's not real happy about it. And what we see through his epistles is his own confession that his ideas are actually losing and competing ideas are winning. And so what we have to ask ourselves today is, the Christianity of today, is it more like Paul's teachings of the New Testament, or is it more like the competing ideas that were winning out during Paul's time? So if we go to Galatians and we start off, let's just start at chapter 1, verse 6. Paul says, I marvel that you're turning away so soon from him who called you into the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel to you than that which we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. Now this is, that paragraph right there is a paragraph that probably every evangelical minister on the planet has preached from. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that they preach it. The reason that they would preach it is because they're preaching against other denominations.
Right. I've heard it used that way. That
sure.
that the Pentecostals were wrong because they're preaching a different doctrine.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And then vice versa. And so it makes sense to us in the 21st century. It makes sense to us that the Baptist preacher gets up and preaches against the Pentecostal preacher, and he uses this paragraph. Mm-hmm. But let's step back and remind ourselves that this paragraph, supposedly, if we take everything at face value, Paul is writing this closer to the first century and closer to the first generation of Christianity, and he's saying this. And so theoretically, there should not have been any Baptist or Methodist or Pentecostals to be preaching against.
Right, because Paul was like the one who actually started Christianity.
Well, he definitely is the first one to do what it is that he does,
right.
to begin to take Christianity out of the hands of the Jewish community and share it with the non-Jews or the Gentiles.
The Gentiles, yeah.
Right. And so now if you go back in time and you put yourself in that position, you can see that Paul's in the same position that the Baptist preacher's in or the Pentecostal mm-hmm. preacher's in today, having other denominations to preach against. Now, the reason this becomes important is because we can very easily, if I'm the Pentecostal preacher preaching against the Baptist, I can very easily make a case that, well, Billy Graham, he's a really, really nice guy, but that doesn't mean his doctrine is divine. He may have missed it early on.
Right.
He could be sincere, but also be sincerely wrong. Well, when you hear about who Paul was in competition with, it's not so easy to dismiss his competitors, because his competitors are people like Simon Peter. His competitors, we're going to see, are people like James, the brother of Jesus, who was actually over the church in Jerusalem. So his competitors are pretty big people, pretty big names, pretty serious competition. So then you have to ask, well, why would Paul's doctrine actually be better than James's doctrine, who he's competing with?
Right.
And the reason that we fall on Paul's side is because it just so happens we have a New Testament that houses more of Paul's writings than it does James's or someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why the New Testament gets as confusing as it does is because as they were assembling the Bible, they did have to put a few things in, like from James and from Peter, not nearly as much as Paul's writings, but it's still injected into the New Testament, and it is contradictory. And because it's contradictory, it creates great fundamental problems in modern Christianity. You'll have Paul saying one thing, that it is not by works, it is purely by grace. But in the same New Testament, you'll have James and Peter seconding in this, that actually it's not just by faith alone,
it's also by
or by
works.
grace, but you also have to have works.
So that would explain the contradiction.
Yes, that is the contradiction. That's the point. That's something that most Christians don't know, is because they're trying to find a third source. They're trying to take what James or Peter says, compare it to what Paul says, and make it come together in a divine way, get a divine revelation of how you fit those two puzzle pieces together. But the reason that you have to find God and have God tell you how to put those two pieces together is because those two pieces don't belong together. They're actually in competition with each other. They're actually two different gospels, two different doctrines altogether.
Right.
And that's one of the byproducts of it. That's a modern day byproduct of this competition, of this confusion that existed in the early church, that has actually shaped the way that we look at Christianity, the way that we look at divinity, and the way that what motivates us in our spiritual lives. Because if you're a modern day, evangelical, then there's a part of you that feels like you're on a quest to find the truth, to find the deeper meaning of things.
Right.
And part of the minister's job is to actually decode the New Testament, decode these confusing pieces of the Bible, make it fit together in a way that's beneficial to your spirituality, to your spiritual success. Well, the reason you have that motivation is because you're basing your belief system off of a book that contradicts itself, and actually contradicts itself intentionally, because Paul is directly opposed to James and in some ways Peter, and vice versa.
Now, Trav in the chat room said, didn't Peter and Paul fall out because of theological differences?
Yes, in some ways they fell out because of theological differences. We'll see that in just a minute. So if you don't mind, I'll continue to read just a little further. Okay, so we left off around verse number 9. Let's jump down to verse 11. Paul says, "But I made known to you, brethren, that gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For neither I received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ." Now, so let's back up. What we're going to see is that Paul is several years. He doesn't come to the forefront. He doesn't get his revelation. He doesn't become a minister, become a Christian until several years, not only after Jesus' crucifixion and death, but also after the formation of the church in Jerusalem and its growth and its heyday. So really, in many ways, Paul is a second generation in many ways. And the point that he's making here is that he did not learn his form of Christianity from James or Peter or any of the other, renowned ministers of his time. Instead, he learned it all on his own. So what Paul literally is Paul is literally the Joseph Smith of his day.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
he
he
kinda made up
literally
his own
is the
thing.
Joseph Smith of his day, because
Yeah.
what Joseph Smith said that he was there to do was that there were all of these denominations in Christianity, and God had called him to straighten it all out and to reveal the truth. And so in Paul's day, there is a form of Christianity that already exists and is already very, strong for what it could be at that time. But Paul comes along and says, I didn't learn anything about Jesus from these other, people. I learned this straight from God myself. And so that gives me more authority and gives my doctrine more credibility.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes on in verse 13 and he says, for you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. This is the type of testimony that the preacher gets up and talks about how he used to, he used to sell drugs.
Right.
He was a male prostitute in Las Vegas.
Right. The fast, loose preacher that found salvation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is the same thing Paul's doing. It's like, how low and bad and ugly and sinful I was. So this makes me look better when you compare it. And then in verse 15, he says, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Listen, this is the important part. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me. But I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. And so what he's explaining to us is that when he got saved, he didn't go learn theology from the Christians who were already in the know. But he learned this on his own.
Yep. Self-taught.
Right?
Yeah.
Self-taught. And that's the foundation. What's so important to this and how it ties into the hope after faith healing message, if you will, is that this characteristic of Paul, not needing to be taught by other people, not conferring with flesh and blood, but having his own revelation and his own personal experience, this becomes fundamental to the modern day Christian experience, that we're all lone rangers. And that I can be sitting in the congregation and the preacher says something I disagree with, and I can feel like God's calling me to set things straight. And God's calling me to go start another church over there, and God's revealing himself to me in a way that he's not revealing himself to other people. So it makes us united in our independence. And it shapes our quest. It shapes our spiritual anticipation and our spiritual expectation. And the reason that's important for Hope After Faith is that molds our personality. And it's sometimes difficult to shake ourselves loose from that and to make conscious decisions after we've graduated from our religion for pure and proper reasons, and not necessarily make those decisions because we still have that very independent spirit. So that's just one of the many byproducts of our side effects that we have from religion, and it comes all the way back from these characteristic memes that we get from these characters out of this very conflicted New Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah. So right off the bat, he's telling us that he's gotten this on his own. All right. So he says, so he goes a little bit further, and in verse 18 he says, then after 3 years, okay, so he's gotten converted and he's already been preaching and he's been receiving this revelation and sharing this understanding. And it's not for 3 more years until he says, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and to remain with him 15 days. But he makes sure that we all understand. He says, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now concerning the things which I write to you, indeed, before God, I do not lie. So he's once again making the point that this is a revelation that's come to him. It belongs to him and to him only. And we'll figure out why as we go through this, of why that's such an important thing. And just to cut to the chase, because our time's limited, the reason that it's so important is because his doctrine is going to be contrary to the doctrine of the other apostles.
Well, didn't he gain all of his knowledge or whatever from the what's it called, the Damascus Road experience?
Right, he gets converted. Right,
yeah, converted, where he actually heard the voice of Jesus.
Right. And the reason that story is important is because it puts him in the category, it qualifies him to be in the category of being an actual apostle, because he claims to have actually physically seen Jesus.
Right.
To where if he had not, then he would just be a disciple like everyone else. But this elevates his credibility. This gives him, this story, this little piece of his narrative gives him a level of authority and supremacy that other people would not have without it.
Right. So it makes him super special.
Makes him super special. Yeah. That's right. It makes him the Joseph Smith out in the woods, with the angel Moroni. I mean, that's what we have here. That is what Christianity is originally based on. Modern day Christianity actually follows the Paulinian doctrine. And the reason it's called the Paulinian doctrine is because we get it from Paul versus getting it from Peter or getting it from James. And that's the core. I mean, Christianity is just founded on a earlier version of Joseph Smith.
Now, we've got about 25 minutes. Now, how was Paul's doctrine different from Peter's? I know that I read that one was about circumcision, the other one was not.
Yeah, so let's jump down. Let's go into chapter 2 of Galatians, and before we get completely done, I'll give several different references. But chapter 2, verse 11, Paul says, "Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he, Peter, would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy." And so here's the thing. So there's been 14 years of time has passed to where, hang on one second. I'm not sure what's going on. Somebody's trying to break into the room.
That's right. Let them break in. They might get some knowledge.
Yeah. So from that first meeting, after 3 years after conversion, then we go 14 years, and there's this big council, and Paul is brought up to have to give an account for what he's teaching the non-Jews who are now believers. And the person he has to answer to is to James and James's entourage. Peter becomes the mediator and kind of gives James and James's crew a reason to accept Paul and what Paul's doing. Peter tells his own story involving Gentiles and seeing them getting saved. And so everybody's supposed to be living happily ever after. So now Peter is down at one of Paul's churches in Antioch. Peter's hanging out, staying with them, attending service and, living with them. And when it's just Peter there, the only representative from Jerusalem, Peter, well, it's just him, then he is eating with the Gentiles, he's hanging out with the Gentiles, and he's basically living out Paul's doctrine. And Paul's doctrine is that everybody's the same, that everybody's now made one in Christ. There's no separation between Jews and Gentiles and those kind of things. But whenever James sends down some of his group and they show up, it intimidates Peter. And Peter is afraid that he's going to be judged by James's group for eating with the Gentiles. And so he backs off and he begins to separate himself from these Gentile believers as a Jew would, and apparently even as a Christian Jew would in the first century. And what that highlights for us is that James and his group were still following the law as Christians. They were still following very particular pieces of the law of Moses, where Paul was teaching that you did not have to do that anymore as a Christian. that Jesus had done away with all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly, what the curtain reveals when it's drawn back is that you have Paul out and about in the countryside preaching to the Gentiles that the law of Moses is done away with through Christ. But in Jerusalem, the headquarters of Christianity, you have James and by default Peter teaching that Christians still have to find a way to be pleasing to God outside of the sacrifice of Christ. And the way they're going to do that is adhering to certain portions of the law of Moses. And this is the reason why in the New Testament, when you read Paul's writings, he's saying it's by faith alone. But then whenever you read James and Peter's writings, they're like, oh, faith is great, but show us your faith through your works.
Right.
You have to have both. So then the real question becomes, whose ideology won out? Well, when you look at modern day Christianity,
Paul's did.
It's obvious that over time, Paul's died out and James and Peter's won out, because almost every denomination within Christianity now has a very long list of precepts that you have to adhere to. That it's not just by faith. Now, doctrinally, they may tell you it's just by faith, but then you also have to get baptized.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, it's just by faith, but you also can't commit adultery without then having to repent and get forgiveness. And so let's go back to that little point right now. So because James and Peter's Jewish hodgepodge of Christianity is the one that eventually won out, and another reason we think that's true is because Paul whines about his churches leaving him and about his followers leaving him, and that the people of this other gospel are taking over. And so we know that carries on all the way to the Council of Nicaea, and it's the reason we end up with Catholicism the way that we do, and there's a long history behind it. But we can see that if you were to use just the strictest version of the Paulinian doctrine, then you probably would not have the sin, guilt, repentance cycle. That might not exist. We get more of that out of the James and Peter way of looking at it, that it's really not just by faith, but it's also about how good you do.
Right.
About how pleasing you are to God. So this creates the sin, guilt, repentance, forgiveness, sin, guilt, repentance, forgiveness cycle that goes on over and over. This is the power, the motivating power that drives Christianity and makes it practical and makes it function within our world. I cannot tell you how many people that I know that have a stricter version of the Paulinian doctrine where there is no sin. Literally, they do not believe sin exists anymore. That when Jesus paid the price for sin, he did away with sin. It's no longer a thing. It doesn't exist in God's mind anymore. So since there's no sin, there's no guilt. Since there's no guilt, there's no repentance, no forgiveness. It's just people living life. Those are some really, really happy Christians, I can tell you.
Oh, yeah, hell yeah.
They really enjoy their lives. The problem is they can't build churches. Because they can't motivate people to come sit in the pews on Sundays.
Right. You need that guilt factor there.
That's right. That's right.
They need to make up a type of illness so that they can sell you the make-believe cure.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So this is once again fundamental. So if the James and Peter version, if it did not outlast Paul, if it did not become embedded within what we know as Christianity today, then you would not really even have the form of Christianity that we know today. And I say someone in the chat room just put in the once saved, always saved. And that's a fantastic point. Once again, let me reiterate, there are doctrines, such as Baptist doctrine, that will tell you that it is by faith and by faith alone. And that's how you can be once saved, always saved. But because this James Peter theology is embedded in Christianity, it opens up all of these weird loopholes and all of these questions. Like, for instance, okay, I get saved at the age of 12, and that Baptist doctrine says once saved, always saved. And later on in life, I am discovered as being a serial killer, and I die in a gun battle with the cops when they're trying to catch me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or of hepatitis from drinking blood or something, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now the Baptists have to do something with that guy. They have to do something with me. And it's like, well, once saved, always saved. Well, really? Can he be saved and live that kind of life? If he lived that kind of life, what they'll tell you is he must not have really been saved.
Well, I think it also comes down to, because I've asked this before, if I was saved in my mom's Southern Baptist church, now that I'm an atheist, they hold on to the once saved, always saved, and once you're saved, you go directly to heaven. Does that mean me being an atheist that I'm still saved and I'm going to heaven?
If they're going to be very, very strict about that piece of their theology, they would have to say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they would have to say yes. But not everybody's going to be that strict to it. Not everybody's going to adhere to it that way, because they're able to go back to some of Peter's writings, and where Peter will tell you, if you do this, 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 and this, then you're not his. You're not
Right.
part of Christ
Yep.
if you do any of these things, regardless of what anybody else is telling you. And so it just depends on which part they're emphasizing. Once again, in the chat room, the point's being made up that the adherents are told that it's really falling short of being Christ-like, and that's exactly right. There are numerous ways of promoting this idea, and for some of the folks that I know who do not believe in sin, do not believe in having to pray for repentance, pray a repented prayer and get forgiveness, they will still say, but I still want to live this Christ-like lifestyle in order to be a good witness and in order to, just be a better human being. So there's a lot of different ways of coming at this, but the reason that I think it's important to the Hope After Faith audience is I still contend that no matter how strong of a quote-unquote atheist we feel like we are, this experience with religion, it shapes our personalities.
Sure.
It literally changes the makeup of our minds. And I think oftentimes we suffer ill effects within our lives, even after we're atheist. And unbeknownst to us, those ill effects are directly the fault of some of these hangover ideas from Christianity. Some of these hangover feelings, if nothing else, just a feeling. So if we're able to go back to the very roots of Christianity, the very foundation, literally push the house that's been built on top of it through modern Christianity, push that out of the way, and even dig up what we think is the concrete slab that it thinks it's sitting on, and literally go to the bedrock and see that is fragmented, that is not what we've been told that it is. Maybe that will help us shake ourselves loose of some of these concepts in a way that we normally don't experience.
Wow.
I'm really running hard and fast tonight, Bobby.
No, you are. Yeah, because when you and I talked about this earlier in the week, I'm like, yeah, man, I can follow you, but you had time to go into details and everything else.
Yeah.
It's interesting to sit back and listen to you talk about how the differences in the two are. Because Paul, Peter, and James are all three held to a pretty high accord within the Christian faith.
Yes.
But I've never heard a pastor teach how they were at odds with each other.
Right. That's right.
Peter was, I remember my pastor teaching that Peter was like Jesus' heart.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. But yet Peter was inside Jerusalem teaching the opposite of what Todd
You just saw Todd in
I
the
did.
chat room, yeah.
I did. Teaching something different from what Paul was teaching and saying that they still had to adhere to the old law, you would think that Paul would be closest to Jesus.
Yeah, Peter? You're talking about Peter?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, right.
I get them confused.
Yeah, no, that's quite all right. No, you're exactly right, especially whenever you have the idea, say Catholicism, the largest Christian denomination on the planet, considers Peter to be the very first pope.
Right.
And that you have an apostolic succession from Peter all the way to modern times.
Mm-hmm.
Well, does that really amount to much if Peter actually was at odds with Paul? So here you have the fundamental character of the Catholic Church is Peter, but he's completely at odds in many ways with the fundamental teaching of the church, which was expressed by Paul.
Right.
So it's the reason that that's important to me is, I don't know about everybody else, but I've definitely experienced this. When you leave Christianity, you can be left with a somewhat of a sense of uncertainty. Like maybe there's something that you missed. Not that it draws you back towards feigning a belief in the supernatural, but like there's an imperfection still in you, that imperfection that you've been taught that exists within you, so that you actually have a need for Christianity in the first place. You can still kind of be left with some of that self-doubt, with some of that, introspection that isn't always positive. Well, if we see that negative self-image may be a byproduct of your religious experience, if we can look back at religion itself, in particular Christianity, and see that it was imperfect, that there was no one true doctrine, that from the very beginning, even expressed within the New Testament that we were forced to believe was divine, that there were actually two gospels, one way of being saved for people who had not been circumcised, and one way of being saved for people who had been circumcised, literally called the gospel of the circumcision, the gospel of the uncircumcision. Mm-hmm. So once we shatter that illusion that there was this one complete divine thought, then maybe our own thoughts become a little bit more liberated.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to go, well, I just see no evidence for the supernatural. Okay, that's great. That makes you an atheist. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to truly liberate yourselves from religious thoughts, the same way it would be to liberate yourself from cultural indoctrination, not just cult indoctrination, but cultural indoctrination.
Yeah. So as we wind this up, what is the final thought on this?
Yeah, so for me, the final thought is that we have evidence within the New Testament itself that all of these people, all of these characters, all of these superstars of Christianity were just people like everyone else, just people like us today, that Peter, James, and Paul actually were at odds with each other because they had different ideas, the same way that different denominations exist today, that Paul was really just a Joseph Smith for Christianity of his day, and that not only are there contradictions that people feel like need to be worked out, but that there are conflicted people within the stories themselves. And so their advice, their ideas, their concepts literally carry absolutely no more weight whatsoever than mine does, than yours does, than the listener's does.
Right.
And so every bit of that can just be flushed away.
Well, see, let me tell you what I brought from this. And this was going through my mind the entire time, and I was just kind of waiting toward the end to say anything. When I look, going back that far, at the differences between Paul, Peter, and James, how they were at odds at each other. Even in today's times, we're still seeing that go on. Even in this community, we see that going on.
Right.
This isn't anything new. Now, of course, we think that once we let go of religion, that we let go of all that BS, right? But
right.
All we have to do is just look, and we see the same type of division. We see the same type of turmoil, not only in the religious part, but also in the secular movement as well.
That's right.
That's
right.
So my thought is, what makes us any better?
I would have to say nothing.
Nothing.
I don't think we're any better at all. My contention has been from 15 minutes after getting involved in the secular movement that no, atheism is not a religion, but the secular movement very well could be.
Boy, could it? Yeah,
and the reason why is because religion doesn't exist. If you suddenly took off every human being out of the universe, then religion would no longer exist, because religion is just a byproduct of human interaction. You can have a form of religion with just two people in the room.
Sure.
You can kind of have some forms of religion with just one person, nobody else around. And so it's a byproduct of the human experience. And so just because we let go of the idea or graduate from our, ideas about supernaturalism, that doesn't mean that we're free from religious behavior.
And I think that is what we're seeing still today within our community, within the secular community. We're seeing that little bit of religious behavior that is still hanging on.
Absolutely.
And
do you have something in particular? You don't have to give any names or any details, but something in particular that's in your craw tonight?
Not that I'm willing to talk about on the air.
Fair enough. I was hoping that it could be general enough that I wouldn't put you in that position. So I apologize.
Well, I can give a general situation, right?
Sure.
Where you have two people within the secular community that are supposed to hold the same values, right? As secular humanists,
right?
Only to have the one side attack or belittle the other side. And it's like, wait a minute, we're all in this together.
Right.
So
right.
I sit back and I watch it and I see what's going on within the community, and I'm sitting there thinking we are no different, we are no better than the type of stuff that we saw in church. It's no different.
Right.
Whenever I left religion and got into the secular community, I didn't expect to see the division that I saw in my hometown church within this community. I thought when you let go of all that bull crap, that we will all be unified under one thought, one goal, one, moving in one direction.
Right.
And that's not at all what we're seeing. And I think that's what gets me so damn frustrated,
Sure.
Because you and I and other people within this community, we work so hard to bring the community together, to unify everyone, only to have a select few that are willing to put a divide in what can be a very strong community that can actually make a difference.
Right.
But we're too busy poking at each other, doing everything we can to knock the other person down, instead of coming together and actually making some changes that we could possibly do if we'd all just get together.
Preach it, brother. I'm going to give you a Darwin.
I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. I agree with everybody in the chat room. Preach, brother Bobby, preach.
It's I love this community, and I love the people within the community, but I don't like the actions of some people within the community. I now understand what my mother meant when she said you can love somebody and not like them.
Right.
You know, I'm starting to fully understand that.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%, and I think in many ways it's even. I think there's more of that division in the secular movement than probably I ever saw in my Christianity days.
I don't think
I know it intimidates me more for sure.
Yeah. Well, I don't think. Well, see, I saw division, but nothing like this.
Yeah.
Nothing. Of course, you've always got one side of the church whispering about the other side of the church.
Oh, sure. That was it. I felt like if I messed up in the church world, then I would just be the subject of gossip until the next person messed up just as bad or worse, and then they would be the subject, not me. But that's all I ever expected from it, was just to be the subject of gossip. I walk on eggshells throughout the secular community because you step on the wrong egghead and you're literally going to be chased down.
Oh, yeah. oh, yeah. Trust me.
And burnt to the ground.
Ask anyone that is a part of our close-knit group how many times I've posted on Facebook in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
I don't anymore.
Right.
It has gotten me so frustrated that I'm at the point now to where I'm ready to just take my Facebook page down. I just don't want to be a part of that anymore.
It's asking for trouble. It
is.
It really is. It's asking for trouble. So I don't feel comfortable. I don't let myself express myself thoroughly, easily, unrestrained in any way near social media or anywhere else for that matter. Now that I'm in the secular movement, I second guess every single word.
Oh, yeah.
And and what's interesting about that, just to pull all those pieces together, is anyone who can sympathize with what we're saying about being in the secular movement. It sounds like the early church was pretty much the same way. So any theology, any concepts, life-limiting concepts that came out of that early church or came out of the New Testament or the Bible at all, we should hold with the same authority as we do some of these nasty posts we see on Facebook. It's just other people's BS.
It is. And me personally, I expect more.
Sure.
From the people in this community. I truly do. I expect more. We are all supposed to be skeptical. We're all supposed to be reasonable. We're all supposed to be critical thinkers. Right? So I automatically expect more from someone in this community than I would someone outside the community that is still strapped into the chair of religion.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. I think that's a pretty fair
more.
Expectation. Mm-hmm.
And I expect more than all I'm doing is I'm finding myself let down everywhere I turn.
Well, I know we've got to go here real quick, but I would say, if I have any insight into that, I would say I think our Achilles heel, because I agree with you, being rationalist, we should expect more of each other because we do have reason on our side, and it should be our method of interpreting the world and reacting with the world. But I think our Achilles heel is that we have focused on our rationality for so long, we have forgotten that we're actually more emotional beings than we are rational beings. And because we leave emotion out of the equation, we don't always fully understand where our motivations are coming from.
Right.
Because we're not practiced in the way that we could be to interpret our own emotions, thus our own motivations.
Right.
We're very quick to just say, that we've got some rational argument for what we're saying or doing, when it may be that we're just little kids on the inside.
Thank you. I was going to use the word juvenile, but that'll work too. Right. All right, folks, we are getting close to the time that we have to go. So we do need to go ahead and get into our closing. Now, keep in mind that next week will be another segment of Stump the Preacher. It has
is it next week already? Excellent. That's fantastic.
Yes. We have received 3 new voicemails so far for Stump the Preacher. So if you think you have what it takes to stump the preacher, call 6307-DEWITT. That's 6307-DWIT, and leave a name, a location, and an item. And a couple of them have not given their name. So please let us know who you are. So in case you do happen to stump the preacher, we'll know who you are and how to get in contact with you. So those three things, name, location, and an item. Just keep in mind we are a family-friendly show with that item. Of course, as we receive multiple requests, we're going to do the same way we did the last time. We're going to pull a number out of a hat, and if your number is called or your number drawn, your voicemail will be played, and we will leave it up to Jerry to show you how awesome he is and see whether or not he can be stumped.
I will do my best. I'm sorry for all the background noise. I'm actually packing up as we go.
That's all right. We can now be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Spreaker. Speaking of Spreaker, that's a tongue twister. Speaking of Spreaker, if you are enjoying the show, please consider going over to Spreaker.com and give us a follow. We're at 130 followers so far, and we're averaging close to 2,000 downloads or listens a week. So those numbers, they just don't add up right to me. So
they don't. That's
no,
so strange.
They don't add up. So if you are enjoying the content, go over to Spreaker.com and follow the show. You will get emails about what's going on with the show when we're going live. If we should decide to go live early, like we have a couple times in the past, you will receive an email telling you that we are, so that you can join us on whatever day of the week it is that we're going go early. Now, we do have iTunes, and speaking of iTunes, we do have a new 5-star rating on iTunes. The individual's name is Rebel Ox. That's REBELOX. Rebel Ox says, "Love this podcast. As a longtime Christian who studies apologetics for years, searching for the capital T truth, it is so good to hear someone who understands that past. It's funny how I can sometimes miss the wording and familiar phrases from that past. Bobby C. and Jerry D. are funny, calm, and rational voices that are wonderful to listen to." So, Rebel Ox, thank you very much for going over to iTunes and leaving us that 5-star rating and that comment. Thank you for that. If you want to join Rebel Ox, go over to iTunes, leave us a 5-star rating, and leave us a comment. We will read it live on the air. I know Jerry's in the midst of packing up, so I'm going to go ahead and bring this thing to a close. I do recommend, if you have not picked up your copy of Hope After Faith, you can go over to atheistaudiobooks.com.
Atheistaudiobooks.com, correct.
And get your audio copy. Also, keep in mind that Jerry does have a Team DeWitt patron page that you can actually get a papered and signed copy of the book by going over there and becoming a patron at a certain dollar amount. You can get a signed copy of the book. I think Jerry said he sent out several books last week.
We did.
Yes.
We sure did.
If you want a signed copy of Hope After Faith, that is one way to make it happen. But other than that, go over to atheistaudiobooks.com I think it sends you right to Audible, and you can download that book. I have it, and I've listened to it several times now. I highly, highly recommend it. If you want to find a show, you can find us on Facebook.com/Hope After Faith Podcast. You can also find us Hope After Faith on Twitter, or you can email Jerry and I at hopeafterfaithpodcast@gmail.com. Jerry, real fast, do you have anything you need to put out to these wonderful people before we get into our closing?
If anybody's looking for me, they can just go to jerrydewitt.net. Next session is opening up. I may have a couple of openings for some life coaching clients. If they're looking for that, they can just reach out to me through Facebook Messenger. But other than that, I am about to hit the road. All righty. Our closing song is Last Prayer by Chris Beelan. You can find his music at beelan.bandcamp.com. For the Secular Media Group and Hope After Faith, until next week, be brave, my friends.
It's lonely when you fade away in a lifetime. And it's lonely when you're out in space with no lifeline. And slowly then you turn around and you notice the length and the time when your heart stops beating. Oh, why won't you come settle down? Stop wasting your time and your mind going on believing No, this won't change. Lord knows you know I can't tell where I'm going, to heaven or falling in hell are my predictions. I only speak what I have heard, and the sound of your words condemn my soul while my soul is here just bleeding. You know my love, it won't hurt. Stop wasting your time and your mind going on believing. Oh, this won't change. And you're gone away, and you're gone away, and you're gone away, away.